Hello, this is Matthew from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm here having a conversation, or about to have a conversation, with Jacob Daniel Winograd from Biblical Anarchy, who's been very kind to accept my invitation to have a conversation. I'm hoping to speak about the Nations of Sanity project itself and the assertions that we present. And in addition to that, I'd also like to cover privatization and borders if we manage it. So before we crack on into the meat of the conversation, I just want to say thank you to Jacob for taking the time to have this conversation.
No, you're welcome, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you, appreciate it. I don't know if you've had a look at like my project or anything like that, or have any idea what it's about. But just for your sake and anybody listening to this who doesn't know what it's about, the Nations of Sanity project is built on the assertion that crime and therefore also law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And we present a three-part peace agreement that we think covers the three basic dimensions that would be required for that to work in the real world. Um, what do you sort of think of that sort of idea and that assertion? Have you got any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a an Austro-libertarian, kind of in the Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist school. So I'm definitely down with self-ownership, and I do think that is the basis of finding a way to solve conflicts in society, finding a way to promote peace, because ultimately that's sort of the end. I often like to put it that I think libertarian principles are not just true, but I think that what makes them so important, the reason why I've devoted so much time to talking about them is because primarily my base foundations in terms of my motivations and ethics are that of a Christian. As you said, I host the Biblical Anarchy podcast with the Libertarian Christian Institute, and so we're told as Christians to be peacemakers. We're told that God gave us the earth to be, stewards over it, and so we have dominion over it. And I'm like, okay, well, if we're gonna make the best use of scarce resources, if we're going to be peacemakers, and we're gonna have to understand how to best pursue those goals. And I think, libertarian ethics and Austrian economics are some of the baseline foundations for the best pursuit of those goals. And it seems like that's sort of what the Nation for Nations of Sanity project is about. So yeah, I looked at your website a little bit, and yeah, I'm a little curious to hear more about what exactly you guys want to do, and but just on the baseline overview of it, it seems to line up with things that I would agree with. So non-aggression principle and all that.
Yeah, libertarian principle, self-ownership. I mean, though I'm not actually a Christian myself, I always found that I mean, I have a few Christian friends who are sort of supportive of my project, and they find a good synergy with regards to the non-aggression principle and the concept of free will as well, with regards to implying a kind of self-ownership. With regards to sort of saying, they believe obviously that God gave man free will, and that obviously implies a kind of self-ownership and autonomy that we're the ones who have to govern our lives, and obviously for better or worse, hopefully for better in the most cases. So yeah, funnily enough, I came across you because I was looking at a lot of Dave Smith's work on borders. I was trying to reach out to him because I actually have a disagreement with his position on the borders thing. I'm not. I don't think that we can justify the enforcement of state borders under libertarian principles. So I was watching a few videos of him talking about it, and obviously caught him speaking with you and your co-host. Sorry, I've forgotten his name.
Matthew Bellis.
Matthew Bellis, yes, and that kind of then kind of led on to me looking at some of your other material, and I just thought, oh, these are be interesting people to speak to as well, and um, I remember there was one point as well where you spoke about sort of privatization, which is why I wanted to speak to you about that in particular. And obviously, you and Dave did obviously discuss the borders issue, and that's another reason why I wanted to speak to you about that as well, because you obviously weren't fully agreeing with Dave on that, but had some empathy for his position. So, and I think also because libertarians are so divided on that, I think that's always something that's worth kind of discussing and getting the different perspectives from as well, because it does seem to be causing a little bit of a rift among libertarians at the moment. Um, with regards to the Nations of Sanity project, one of the things that kind of led me down my own train of thought with regards to it was um, I kind of because the beauty I have, as especially speaking as somebody who doesn't have like a kind of faith-based kind of foundation for morality, is I kind of like look at the I like the objective truth that the a concept of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle represents with regards to the kind of logical progression. Like if you start with that presupposition of rights being that everyone has a right over themselves and only themselves, then that kind of makes everything um what's the word, like self-evident from that. Like it's not debatable that stealing's wrong once you've established that. It's not debatable that rape is wrong once you've established that. All of these things come as a logical progression. It becomes 2 + 2 = 4. It's as objectively true as mathematics, providing you obviously accept the presupposition of self-ownership. But once you've got that, then everything else kind of lays out in front of you. So for me, I just found that to be such um, a compelling moral truth, because one of the things about morality is generally people think of it as subjective, and it kind of is in many ways, because a lot of people say, is that I don't know if you heard the phrase of the whole and I'm going to butcher the phrase, but it's something along the lines of you can't get an ought from an is, basically saying that you
Hmm.
can't deduce morality from simple facts alone. But and I think that's true. I don't think you can get around that. But what you can do is you can get an ought from an is if you have a presupposition, if you have the hypothetical imperative that you want a moral framework in the first place. Like I kind of say that people have got two choices. They can reject morality out, overall. They can reject the concept of rights overall and just say might makes right, and there is no right and wrong. And you can't really dispute that. But once they invoke the concept of rights, then you have to find a foundational principle underneath that. And the only one that works, that's consistent and internally consistent and universalizable are, from that presupposition, is the concept of individual self-ownership. And then once I had that as my kind of foundational moral truth, um, then it also became equally kind of self-evident, at least in my mind, that well, that defines crime objectively. Like what is and isn't a crime, where our rights end, where our freedom ends, isn't something that kings and queens should decide or democratic majority should decide. It's self-evident from the underlying principle. So if this principle defines law objectively, which I would say that it does, then the logical progression from that is then we should establish it as the law. And the only way to establish it as the law without contradicting itself is as the terms of a peace agreement, because obviously you can't have a ruling authority saying this is the law because we say so, because the principle itself prohibits rulers. It prohibits people dictating rules based on their own whim. But this law wouldn't be based on that whim. It would be based on an objective truth. So anyway, that's my kind of journey to this kind of idea in this project. Obviously, I didn't invent any of these principles or concepts or anything like that. This is just kind of my angle. Everyone's got their own kind of way of trying to create a free society. There's lots of libertarians out there coming at it from different angles, and I suppose that's kind of mine.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense. I mean, that's, I'm curious if you would, um, with what you're describing there, sounds a lot to me like sort of private law theory in terms of how do we administer things like because like we believe in the concept of law, right? So there's like natural law and what we can sort of reason out. And I remember having this conversation actually just earlier today with someone, and we were actually having a disagreement because they were a self-described anarchist, and he's a friend of mine, but he was saying, because we were talking about police, and there's a common expression among not just libertarians, but also just kind of like left. You also hear this from like leftists and stuff. So the acronym is ACAB, and so it's all cops are. I'm a good Christian, so I'm not supposed to swear, I say all cops are bastards. That's the term, and and so generally I understand where that sentiment comes from because the police, uh, as they exist in our current statist paradigm, are certainly the enforcement arm of the state and certainly are responsible for a lot of rights violations. However, other than just kind of like well, it's not literally all cops. There are, some cops in certain areas where uh I wouldn't describe them as bad people. There's even cops, sheriffs who sort of heroically decided to not enforce like COVID mask mandates and other things. And so I think there can be a good cop, although I do admit that it's hard in the current system. But then beyond that, it's like and actually I talked about this on that interview with Dave that you mentioned, that libertarians generally want to, in regards to the things that the state does, we don't want to abolish it or privatize it, and that kind of requires a little bit of abstraction to know, okay, well, is this a legitimate service or not? And although with something like, let's say here in America, like the IRS, that's not really a legitimate service. We don't want private racketeers, we don't want people privately going around extorting wealth from people. But the ideas of security and the adjudication of property rights and disputes, well, that's a legitimate service. And so, the things that police are, said to do that justifies their existence, the things that courts and law enforcement do, um, those are things that are like society needs. And so, as a, Rothbardian, ANCAP or Rothbardian libertarian, I uh remember when I first stumbled into the idea of private law, it just made a lot of sense to me. The idea that you can have instead of a monopoly over civil governance, that you can push govern the services that we want governance for into the market, and then people can come up with these voluntary agreements, and these can take various forms. You can have dispute resolution organizations that people join, or like individual liability insurance companies that offer to represent you in case you get into conflicts with people over uh, scarce goods or whatnot. You can have private courts that adjudicate, property disputes and things like that and enforce contracts. And obviously voluntary agreements between, people. So like what you're describing reminds me of like how people ask like, well, how do you, you know, like how do you determine whose property is whose in like a community or neighborhood? It's like, well, you would have, agreements with people around you. Um, and that's going to take different shapes and forms depending on where you're at and the particular geography of where you're at. But, and so it can sound like a lot of work, but it, to me, that's like, well, nothing that's good comes easy, right? And so we can either decide to take that personal responsibility to govern ourselves and come up with these solutions, or continue relying on the like easy monopoly of the state, but because it's easy, because it's created, like it's force, right? So of course it's easy. Like it is harder to get people to agree to something than to point a gun at them and compel them to do it. But that doesn't mean that just because it's easier means it's better. So, yeah, everything you're talking about definitely maps onto the things that I think are, they when people first hear about this, it can be, uh, it can sound a little bit crazy, but like once you really start looking into it and reading it, then you kind of realize that it's just a logical way of resolving disputes. And actually you can see some of this like already exists. Like there already are examples of private arbitration and third party arbitration and voluntary agreements that people work out in the market all the time. And so we're just saying, hey, let's expand that. Let's expand peaceful relationships and minimize and work to reduce and eventually eliminate the ones that are based on violence and coercion.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a good point about the police as well, because I mean, obviously, a big thing about the Nations of Sanity project, and one of the big pushbacks I certainly get from a lot of anarchists is when they hear the word law, and it's like, oh, because they just think statism, law, and but like, you make a good point,
They need to read
obviously,
Bastiat.
yeah, I have heard that come up a few times. But one of the things that kind of like I like to sort of remind people of is like, okay, forget for a moment that the police are funded through the theft of taxation, because obviously that in itself makes them kind of a coercive entity no matter what they're doing. But just look at,
Right.
like you say, the services that they're providing. If you took that coercion out of how they're being funded, then you look at what they're doing. Now, some of what they're doing is still coercive because many of the laws that they enforce are obviously immoral and in themselves violations of the non-aggression principle. But a lot of obviously the laws they enforce are enforcing the non-aggression principle. Obviously, things like theft, rape, murder, and assault are obviously laws that are enforced by the state and are classed as crimes by the state. And even though some of those laws they kind of violate themselves, obviously, obviously taxation being an obvious one where they circumvent theft laws and stuff like that. But so yeah, there's nothing inherently wrong with a law enforcement. What's wrong with our current law enforcement is one, obviously, how they're funded and the coercive system that they operate within. And then the other thing is what laws they're enforcing.
Right.
And this is one of the things, this is where the Nations of Sanity comes in to save the day and just sort of say, look, well, that's a very simple thing because we need to kind of define our society with this universal, perhaps established, formalized understanding that the only law anyone's allowed to enforce with violence is the non-aggression principle. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have other rules, like you say, that are part of voluntary agreements. We can all join a club, and then all of a sudden, it's not just the non-aggression principle; it's whatever rules apply to that club that the members agree to. But those rules only apply to the people, that are part of that club. And if that
Right.
involves going onto a property, then obviously the punishment for not obeying that is you can be kicked out of the property and you can be kicked out of the club if it's a more of a ethereal club rather than somewhere where people meet. So this is that whole, and it all comes back to that same principle. That's the thing I love about it. Again, is a lot of this stuff becomes self-evident. You can kind of just work it back to the principle. When there's a kind of an issue, it's like, well, what does the principle say? We don't need to go to a ruling authority in the sense of deciding it. The principle kind of decides it for us. So and I think that's something that gets lost with a lot of people with regards to particularly people who are not libertarians, like current statists who haven't yet been converted to the light, because a lot of them, particularly words like anarchism, they think of chaos and lawlessness and a lot of negative connotations. But even with libertarianism, they'll get the wrong idea. I've had so many arguments with people of a left persuasion. I wouldn't say arguments, but discussions where a lot of their resistance just comes down to their kind of economic ideology. But one of the things that they'll often say is like, well, why can't we have this? Why can't we have a cooperative this or a communal that? And I always say, you can. As long as you're doing it with your own property and consenting adults and all
Right.
the rest of it, you
Just
can do
can't make people be part of it.
exactly, exactly. And but the thing is, when you clarify that, and one of the things I like to do, particularly when I'm presenting this idea of the Nation Sanity Project, because I'm saying, look, if we had these as our terms of peace, then one of the things that would like not get in the way, particularly with the left and right divide. Because one of the things I don't know if you have the same opinion as a libertarian, but one of the things that I kind of get frustrated with is I see the kind of left right argument where they're kind of sniping at each other, and they're both kind of right and wrong at the same time because they can both point to hypocrisies on the other side. I mean, freedom is a perfect example. If you want to talk freedom of speech, very recently the left have been very authoritarian and anti-freedom of speech, but there's plenty of areas where I could pick at the right wing's dedication to freedom of speech. Like if I burnt an American flag, I'm quite certain there's plenty of right wingers that would lose their dedication to freedom of speech and expression if they saw me doing that. Assuming it's my own property and all that. And I'm not burning somebody else's property. So everybody, both sides kind of like freedom when it applies to the things they like, and they don't like it when it applies to the things they don't. And one of the things I like about libertarianism, at least when it's applied consistency, is we don't go with our preference. We go with what people have the rights and freedom to do. And we might still have our preferences with regards to how we want society to be. But we realize that there's, like, for example, I always say, if the non-aggression principle was the law, there's a lot of things that would be legal that wouldn't necessarily be good for society, like certain drug use, prostitution, gambling. These aren't necessarily good things, but they're not in of themselves crimes, because if you own yourself, you have the right to gamble, you have the right to sell your body, you have the right to put whatever you want into your body. That doesn't make it a good idea. That doesn't make it something we want our society to be filled with. But we have to understand that if everybody's free, then the only influence that we can have over their activities are the voluntary influences, the non-violent influences. But at the same time, we've got to understand that we don't have to be pacifists either and let people commit aggression against us and rob us and all the rest of it. So we need to know where we draw the line and where violence can be used. And that's where we kind of set our limits of tolerance. And that is the only, because the other thing about it is like a lot of people talk about things like this as being a bit of a pipe dream, libertarians are, the fringe and all the rest of it. But if we're ever going to get it right, this is the only way. I mean, this is the only law where we can all live under in freedom. These are the only terms of peace that we can all live under, no matter how different we otherwise are. You know what I mean? So it's like, if we're going to get it right, it's going to look something like this. And none of us have like the exact precise answer for exactly how to do society. But one of the things that libertarian tells us is well, unless we can persuade people peacefully, then we don't have much say in society. We can't force it. And even if, because the thing is like you say, sometimes, maybe there is out there a benevolent dictator who could rule us and genuinely make every person in the world happier than they would have otherwise been if they were in charge of their own lives. It doesn't change the fact that he didn't have the right, or she didn't have the right, to rule over us and take that decision away from us. And one other thing that one of my religious friends actually reminded me of, and it was when I was mentioning the free will aspect with regards to the connection between libertarianism and, well, his religious belief. He was a Christian as well, or he is a Christian as well. But he also said about, like, he says it robs us of our charitable doings as well, because so many of the things that we would do and probably do a lot better through our own voluntary actions are kind of robbed from us by the government forcing us. I mean, I know in America it's different, but over here in England, obviously, we have like a socialized healthcare system. Now, I'm not against providing people free at the point of use healthcare, although I always emphasize it's not free, it's only free at the point of use. But I am against it being done under a coercive system where no one has a choice about it, because that's exactly why our NHS is a corrupt, bureaucratic, mismanaged mess. Because we don't have any power to do anything about it when it gets that way. We still have to pay into it, we still have to use it, and if we find it working so badly that we have to go private, we have to pay for our private care, plus still continue to pay for the socialized system as well. That's why things don't end up working on merit. Whereas one of the things I like to point out to my leftists is I say, look, even the socialized systems that you want, and I'm talking socialized with regards to kind of collective, forgetting the coercive aspect of it, I say even these things you want, they would operate better in a kind of meritocracy where they're only existing if the people that are funding them see the value in them and see that they're actually worth funding, however that's done, whether it's through some kind of contributions, whether it's through a kind of voluntary like tax, whatever the kind of system they want to set up. If it's done like that, because a lot of things they'll say is, oh, because a lot of things that like a lot of socialists like to say when they're arguing with capitalists is they say, oh, well, it would be better this way. And it's like, well, if it genuinely would, you don't need to put a gun to anybody's head to do it, because you can create these systems and people will say, oh yeah, it is actually better to be part of this collective, and and let's all have this national insurance for our health because we could afford treatments that are harder to afford individually and stuff like that. If that's better, then it will prove itself to be in a voluntary system. But all the time we have coercion, everything gets perverted and distorted. So
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Uh, One thing you mentioned that, about the left and the right can both uh, get things wrong. Well, another thing they can do is often point to things that are right, and so kind of brings up the issue of the borders that I know you also wanted to talk about, because the problem with, there's sort of like two ways looking at libertarianism, and so people will divide it into, and you don't have to be like dogmatically one or the other. You can kind of hold them both. But you have like deontological libertarianism, and then you have consequentialist libertarianism. And deontological meaning just like it's we adhere to this principle because it's good, and consequentialism would be more like we adhere to it because it produces the best outcome that we want. Um, and so I tend to be more of a deontological libertarian, but I think a good test of your theory, like if it's good, it should also probably produce good outcomes. And so if you say something's good and it produces bad outcomes, then you might want to go check your math on that. And so, uh, and happily, libertarianism generally is in the, it's good deontologically and it produces good outcomes. Consequently, the reverse, meaning that when it's not voluntary, when it's statist, when it's coercion, it does the opposite. It produces bad outcomes. And the problem is, democracy notwithstanding, there's not good checks against that. Like in the market, if someone produces a bad product, no one buys it. They either go out of business or they re-innovate, come up with a way to make a better product. We don't have that choice. And again, democracy notwithstanding, it provides, I guess, the littlest check. And maybe you could say democracy is, as I think, like Mises put it, it's like the least bad form of government, maybe. Some people dispute that. I don't know where I would kind of agnostic. I mean, it's kind of like what's the least bad form of rape? I don't know. I don't care. It's still bad. Like I don't need to. It's sort of a dumb question to ponder about. Like it's just wrong. I don't really care about the least wrong from a moral sense. Pragmatic sense, okay, fine. But yeah, at any rate, when we have these monopolies of violence, we see that we get these bad outcomes, and the left and the right will often point to the bad outcomes, and you'll see that they'll both be right simultaneously in terms of like pointing to where there's a problem, and then they'll be wrong with the prescription of how to fix it because they don't understand the root of it. The border is a great example of this because if you're on the left, you're going to look at the fact that our immigration laws here in like the United States are a giant mess. If you want to migrate here, immigrate here legally, there are all sorts of hoops you have to jump through. There's a waiting list. There's artificial quotas. It's kind of hard to understand. Like I live here and I don't quite fully understand the process. I've looked at many graphs trying to simplify it, and like even like graphs like you'll see graphs or graphics that'll be like, the U.S. immigration system simplified, and it's still like this massive flow chart that like zoop, zoop, zoop. It's like you have to do all that, and then there's different categories. Like if you want to come here for to work, if you want to come here to visit, if you're seeking asylum or refuge, and it's just it's a giant quagmire. And you have people who've been waiting for years to come here legally, and so the left looks at that and goes, "That's not right." Like, okay, agreed. Now the right, they're going, "Hey, we have a welfare state, and we have." Okay, like maybe theoretically, okay, if people want to come here, okay, but like that would kind of, there's a difference to just like your eyes and your observation between what would look like natural movement of people and what looks like unnatural movement of people. And now some things can be, like one-off events that be natural. Like if, let's say, I don't know, there was some kind of like catastrophic uh like climate event in like Mexico or something. Maybe like people, it was like giant floods and tornadoes, and people are okay. Like you can justify or like kind of like, oh, this caused that. But when it's not something like that, and then you have the problems you have here in America along the southern border, where you have millions of people trying to come across at any point. People look at that and they rightly go, well, that's not right. Like that's not normal. That's not how. And they're right. Like in a libertarian society, you wouldn't have a like the American war on drugs, which has empowered the cartels and caused all sorts of problems in Central and South America. There's also been, as much as people like to focus on the wars in the Middle East and in Russia and Ukraine, there's been plenty of U.S. military and intelligence operations in Latin and South America, which have caused destabilization in their countries as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people fleeing these broken down, chaotic countries that they from that are overrun with crime, overrun with problems, and so they're fleeing that in mass numbers often. And on top of that, you have trafficking, you have the actual drug cartels themselves. You have all this movement around the border, none of it which is caused by just natural free market forces. And then the right's going like, wait a second, they're not coming here legally, and the government's not doing anything about it, and it's unnatural. And it's like, right. So like, now what do we do about that? That's been an ongoing debate within libertarian circles for a long time, and that's heated up a lot recently as the problem has worsened. But the left and the right are at least like they're you can give them credit where it's due, where they point out problems, and you can acknowledge, yes, those are problems. But then, what I always tell people, and even Dave and I agree with this, and I would imagine that you would agree as well, that the ideal solution is, of course, to abolish the state border entirely, and to end all these other interventions, the war on drugs and things like that, because they're creating all these distortions. And so the only true solution to it is like, well, the problem is like, if you're having a debate over what the state should do with this imaginary border it's created, with its imaginary, authority that it's, obtained at the point of a gun, well, that's just the wrong question to have on a philosophical level. It's like, well, they don't have the right to create that border in the first place. So the minute it exists, it's a distortion, it's a problem. The true solution is privatization, in my opinion, in terms of like, the full realization of a private property society that would actually result in the natural movement of people. But how do we get there? That seems to be the issue, is that, you and I, would seem to agree, on the philosophical principles of libertarianism, voluntarism, private property rights, economics, the correct way of enforcing these things, enforcing laws. But we are so far off from that, and so I often divide it into libertarians have conversations about theory, and we tend to, minarchists and anarchists disagree a little bit there, but even then, I would say 90% we agree with. The major disagreements come through more in strategy, in terms of like, how do we start moving towards that society that we want, and what do we do about the problems that the state creates in the status quo. And so, as you alluded to, I had a conversation with Dave about that, because Dave has a take on how to deal with the border problem that not a lot of libertarians are on board with. Some are, but a lot of them are like, I don't know about that. And so yeah, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are in terms of, that subject and what I laid out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm the same as you. I'm ontological. I say we do it because it's right, and that's what the principle tells us. And I also agree that more often than not, we will get the right outcome as well. But I let what's right at the time kind of guide me, because also sometimes I think even from the like sorry, what was the other thing of opposite to ontological? The other
Consequentialism.
consequentialist. Even taking the consequentialist route, sometimes that outcome is not always obvious. So you need that ontological guidance
Right,
because you
exactly.
don't have that predictive power. And I think that's one of the things that's driving Dave. Because, like you say, even though I disagree with him on his stance on the borders, I know that we are all agreeing on the same fundamental principle and ideal scenario if the government wasn't there and all the rest of it. Although there is a little area I want to quibble over with the privatization and just go into the details of that, because there might be some areas where we disagree. But generally speaking, yeah, we agree that the government border isn't valid, but we also understand that we live in a world where it's not a free society. We do have government. We do have government obviously robbing us. There is a welfare state. There is all of these externalities. And that makes it a bit more, or it makes it not so simple. From my point of view, the problem is even with those externalities, the idea of enforcing a state border is still anti-libertarian. It is still like a violation of that principle. And I understand why people are like, well, yeah, but we've got all these other violations and those things could be made worse. But from my point of view, is like, yeah, but that is really an argument for dealing with those other things, for dealing with those externalities, because dealing with those would be the libertarian solution, like getting rid of the welfare state, ending taxation. They might seem like more ambitious goals, although to be honest, I don't think Dave's solution is. I think his is quite ambitious as well, of calling back the entire military and putting them on the southern border. Doesn't exactly.
I kind of pointed that out. I was like, I mean, as far as like realistic solutions go, I'm like, listen, like the prospect of bringing the military home, putting them on the border, although it would be a disaster on the border, I'm still, just because I'm, one of the things that got me into libertarianism was my anti-war stance. I've always been anti-war, And so the idea of ending the empire, ending all the wars abroad, closing all the military bases, getting out of NATO, I was like, heck yeah. But just on that alone, like, well, that's like that's not happening anytime soon. Like Donald Trump spent 4 years to barely get us out of one war, and you know, and that was a total disaster. So like not that I'm trying to give Trump a lot of credit because he's still awful statist, but like he was the least bad on war in my lifetime for U.S. presidents. And even with that, like we were barely able to get out of one, and it's almost like we ended one and started two more in its place. So it's like the net amount of war that America's spewing doesn't seem to decrease; it only seems to increase. So, but yeah, I cut you off there. But yeah, it's
Yeah, no,
Dave's
but
solution certainly is a little pie. It's a little pie in the sky, but I get where he's
exactly.
coming from.
Exactly. And I suppose my point would be is if we were ever going to have that level of control over our government that we could enact something like that, then we could just as easily enact these more libertarian approaches that make that would get rid of a lot of the externalities that actually make immigration the problem that it is. And also the other point I make would make to Dave and anybody obviously from that on that side of the argument is, like if you get rid of these externalities, like the immigration problem takes care of itself to a large degree. But even if you were to solve the immigration, let's say you had a magic wand to only fix one thing, and you chose it to fix the immigration thing, and even with Dave's like ideal scenario, all the other externalities are still there. Like, we're still being robbed. Our welfare system is still what it is. All right, it's not being made worse by the immigration influx, but it's all still there. All the things that are causing our society to crumble are all still there. And I even used Dave's own analogy when he was talking about why he wouldn't support Trump, because even though he considers him better than Biden, he used the analogy of a car heading towards the end of a cliff at 120 miles an hour, and Trump would slow it down to 80, but no one, he still would only want to support someone who's turning it around. And I'd kind of use that same analogy with regards to the immigration thing. It's like, well, even if you solve the immigration problem, that's like the equivalent of slowing the car down that's driving off to the edge of the cliff. You know what I mean? We need to deal with these other issues. Otherwise, it's kind of a thing. Before we continue the conversation, I didn't realize I need to upgrade my Zoom to get more than half an hour at a time. So
I
if you
was
don't
seeing,
mind,
I saw the time remaining. I was going to say something.
yeah. So if you don't mind, I'm going to stop this, just let it upload, and then call you back in a couple of minutes. Is that okay for like a second
Yeah, that's
part?
fine. Yep.
Thank you. I'll just stop it now.